Okay, everybody. I think everybody's making their way to their seats. I hope everybody's got a snack and that you're energized and ready to help us kick off the Policy Speaker Series for 2019-2020. My name is Warren Mabey. I'm the Director of the School of Policy Studies, and I want to welcome you all here. I'm very, very pleased to see such a terrific turnout for our speaker today. And our speaker does not need a long introduction, so I will not give a long introduction. I'm going to give him as much time as I can. Hugh Segal is currently a Matthews Fellow and a distinguished fellow within the School of Policy Studies. Previously, he's been the director, is that the term right now, of the Massey College at U of T. It had another title? Principal of Massey College. Prior to that, as most of you know, he was a senator and served prior to that as a chief of staff to both a prime minister and to a premier in Ontario. And so this wealth of experience that he's bringing to the table and knowledge is something that I know we're all going to benefit from. So rather than myself going on and on, I think what I'd like to do is just to have you all join me in welcoming Hugh to the podium.
Warren is my new boss, so I'm always very respectful in his presence, and I know I speak for many who are delighted that he accepted the directorship of the school and taking it in new and very exciting directions. I'm glad to see the PMPA folks here. This is, I think, day 2 or day 3 of the cycle, and we're delighted you're here. Certainly in my experience in the school, the mix between the PMPA mid-career people who have their own very important professional experiences, and the students who are doing it full-time is a very rich and constructive mix in a whole bunch of areas. My experience was when I was teaching a course in the spring semester was that if you'd ask a tough policy question, all the full-time students had an instant, well thought out, and very clear answer. They knew exactly what the answer to the question was. People with experience in the public service, not so sure. A bit more gray lines, perhaps, than might be the case. But just having that mix is constructive. I'm glad to be back at Queen's. In 1993, I came to Queen's as a refugee from the Mulroney government. They had not yet ended. I had ended my term as chief of staff because it was time. And they were about to select a new party leader, and you may recall that that election of 1993 produced the smallest conservative caucus in the history of any country in the world. I remember being on TV as a panelist with Peter Mansbridge on election night, and the numbers came in. We began with about 170 odd seats. And the Maritimes, we had about 20 seats, and we came back, we had 1 seat after the Maritimes. And Peter looked at me and said, this is shaping up to be the worst defeat for any political party in the history of the world. I said, Peter, don't, we haven't heard from Quebec yet. Quebec's going to come rolling in. It's one of our strong areas. It came rolling in, we had 1 seat. Charest was it. And Peter said, this really is the worst defeat for any democratic political party in the world. And I said, the West. The West is John Diefenbaker country. It's Saskatchewan, it's Alberta, it's going to be don't, you know. And I was thinking to myself, there's still some polls open in BC. And I didn't want to be the person saying, we're toast. Because there might have been 1 or 2. Anyway, the West came back 0 from the West, right? So we had 2 seats. Which meant that, at that moment in time, more Canadians thought Elvis Presley was alive than had voted for Mrs. Campbell in that election. And at the end of the evening, Peter Mansbridge said, I told you, this is the worst defeat in the history of democratic politics. How do you, as a conservative, respond to that? And I said, well, you know, in a democracy, the people are always right. On occasion, they get a little carried away, however, but they're always right. You know, we're all in this room because we care about government at some level, either as practitioners or as people who want to get advanced academic standing in support of a career in the public sector or in the related sector, or as people who have been outstanding academics and researchers in the area, and we care about the process. We care about the instruments of government. We care about the underlying disciplines like economics and political science. We care about the Constitution. We care about public management. We care about a whole bunch of things which inform and direct the process. The case I'm going to make to you today is that we also have to care about results. And that if we don't care about results and if we don't focus on them, the results, when they do not show up in a way that have a positive impact in people's lives or give people who are being served by government a measure of hope, a legitimate sense of fairness, that's how the legitimacy of our system is put under deep, deep, deep challenge. And when you look at what our authoritarian and dictator friends around the world are doing as they try to use social media and other instruments, I'm not one of those who believes that they're out to get one particular party elected or one particular candidate defeated. I think what they're out to do is to magnify the divisions, count on the lack of results in many aspects of democratic government, and use that to have Canadians question the legitimacy of our own system, as they wanted Americans and French voters and others to do over the last few years. And of course, the reason they want us to question the legitimacy of our system is because they can't defend the legitimacy of theirs. And they don't have any internal context of accountability or independent courts or free press or media, which holds them accountable in the way that governments are held accountable justifiably in our part of the world. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about that in the time we have here. I've entitled the talk, The International Rule-Based Order, Time for a Rethink, and I'll share with you what I meant by that obscure title. Let me first of all say that I really am honored to be here and make my first presentation as a Donald J. Matthews Fellow at the School of Policy Studies. Don Matthews was a brave Canadian soldier in World War II, an engineering student and graduate at Queen's. While at Queen's after the war, he headed the CCF, today NDP club, on campus, and fought for fair treatment of veterans. After graduation, he built a successful housing and construction business, became active in the Progressive Conservative Party, served as its president, and was always looking for ways to philanthropically strengthen his community, Queens in particular. It's an honor to join David Dodge and Don Drummond and Margaret Biggs in this fellowship at Queen's, and it's a specific honor to be with all of you here this morning. When I last spoke in this room about the International Rules-Based Order, I focused on how it was built in the post-war years and why, and especially why at this point in the world's history it had to be protected and defended. I discussed who its enemies were and what the differences were between the authoritarians who preached for a new world order, one without respect for diversity, dissent, tolerance, democracy, or individual choices about lifestyle, religion, or politics, and why the democracies that did respect key areas of pluralist rights and freedoms deserved protection and support. Over the last 2 years, I think we have seen a steady dilution of the underlying civility and international cooperation that were so intrinsic to the preservation and promotion of a world where most countries embraced democratically endorsed small L liberal goals for the long-term best interests of their people. Moreover, they were prepared to work together wherever possible in that collective best interest. While comparing our present disjointed global context to the years immediately before World War II would be perhaps a touch overwrought, it would be both naive and delusional to ignore all the similarities between our present global reality and pre-war history. We do so at our peril. As middle powers like Canada and smaller countries worldwide that face more serious environmental, social, and economic challenges, we all depend on a global management framework where sovereign countries interact by agree-to conventions and treaties for sorting out both differences and common international goals. These are in fields as diverse as trade, disease prevention, global health, environmental responsibility, preventing war and bloodshed. The global erosion of important areas of liberal consensus adds substantially to the risk spectrum with which we must all now cope as Canadians. This is a fresh challenge, different from ones we have faced in the post-war years, especially when we now see that America first is rapidly becoming America alone. A multipolar world is not intrinsically bad, but a multipolar world where authoritarian governments like China or Russia or Iran or North Korea or Saudi Arabia have increasing regional or international influence without any internal accountability to their own citizens or impartial courts is a world where freedom, diversity, and dissent are facing serious risk. How best can we embrace both the challenge and opportunity this fresh need to address the rules-based democratic global compact actually generates? The first step I would suggest is coming to grips with the imperfections that are real within that order and how they are reflected in our own country's day-to-day reality. First of all, we must set aside the weakness that ensues when we let complacency about genuine failings within our own democracy be obscured by comparisons to the failings of our non-democratic competitors. One of the glaring dichotomies between authoritarian states and more genuinely open democracies is that open democracies are driven by open political debates about agenda, priorities, policy failures, and policy needs. Democratic and competitive elections reflect some of that, just as free collective bargaining, market competition, free and open media and press all facilitate those debates and divisions every day, which speaks to our openness as a society. These debates and divisions are viewed, by the way, and have been identified as key weaknesses of democracy by the authoritarian governments in Moscow, in Beijing, in Pyongyang, in Tehran, in Jeddah, and elsewhere. It is and always has been a classic political evasion to blame one's own internal economic, social, or political difficulties on people and governments elsewhere. This blaming of others happens within countries sometimes and between countries. No one is immune from the infection of easily blaming others for your own failings. All of this, whether expressed in extremis by Beijing blaming other countries for the brave pursuit of freedom by young Hong Kong demonstrators, or by the current American president blaming immigrants, both present and prospective, for long-standing American economic and social areas of dysfunction, or the Kremlin blaming outsiders for the thousands of Russians courageously demonstrating in the streets for a real democracy to replace the kleptocratic pretend democracy more and more Russians reject every day, speaks to the same unavoidable tendency of dictators to blame others and never ever admit to domestic failings associated with their own regime. But observing and understanding that myopia and self-reverence in others is no excuse for evading or avoiding our own social and economic failings in our own country. Failings that, if left unaddressed, will themselves weaken the core values and purposes we ascribe to in our societies and democracies. While the challenges in democracies like the United Kingdom, India, South Africa, Sri Lanka, or Hungary may seem more acute than our own, we would be guilty of a form of denial if we understated our own challenges. The best way to ensure the survival of our international rules-based democratic order is to be blunt and specific about the weaknesses we have not addressed within our own societies and make their remediation a critical national priority. That simple act of intellectual honesty and political realism would set us apart from the regimes that lack the honesty, integrity, or minimal accountability to public opinion or the voter to do the very same. For all the remarkable successes of Western societies since the Second World War, the economic growth, the expansion of quality of life, the use and creation of new technologies, the relatively unparalleled extended period of peace, the greater reach of higher education, the expansion of human rights, more open trade, and remarkable international mobility, there is one area of failure in our economic model about which we need to be brutally frank. For any product or idea, or service or brand or system to be successful, it must be high quality, enduring, renewable, of intrinsic value, be properly priced, and have a solid and sustainable distribution plan. A movie that is not available to a wide audience will not succeed. A recipe only available to a very few will not have a viable customer base. A product of any kind that lacks a distribution strategy is intrinsically weaker than one that does. We owe it to ourselves throughout the Western democratic world to be honest about the extent to which the distribution part of our otherwise dynamic economic and social model has been far less than optimal. Poverty rates in leading democratic countries, despite the many successes of the free or mixed market economy, have simply left too many people out of the benefit side of the equation. This failure has not only left tens of millions of our fellow human beings beneath the poverty line in advanced and wealthy societies like our own, but has also failed to generate the resilience to cope with the risk of poverty faced by fellow citizens for whom prospective technology changes, possible handicaps, or shifts of capital portend enhanced poverty risk in the future for them or their families. If poverty itself promotes bad health, poor education outcomes, family dysfunction, substance abuse, potential trouble with the law, as it surely does, in dimensions that seriously exceed levels in the general population, fear of being forced into poverty breeds anger, reaction, bitterness, and jealousy in ways that can seriously imbalance the democracy of any country. As we have seen elsewhere, it is civility and generosity of spirit that suffers first and most intensely. It behooves all of us to reflect on our own distributional and civility challenges right here in Canada, if we genuinely believe that our fellow democracies around the world should do the same. These challenges are not the fault of any one government or political party, but they do reflect a political and social culture that has become too comfortable with looking away from glaring examples of where we could and should be doing more. Seeking to address genuine areas of weakness at home, working with allies to address those weaknesses abroad, is the best way to strengthen the international liberal rules-based order. Papering over weaknesses is the best way to help those authoritarian regimes that seek to weaken public support in our countries for democracy, diversity, and inclusion. Let me offer a few examples. 1, the gap between the very rich and the very poor is not narrowing at all in our country. And in fact, the accretive pace is increasing for the wealthiest in our societies to gain more wealth more quickly. Our generic tolerance for this gap and our collective acquiescence in face of the harder, shorter, and more painful lives lived by millions of our fellow Canadians is a stain on our national honor and social and economic reputation. It is not that some progress has not been made, it is that so much more needs to be done. 2, ever since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, democracies in the West have confused the ills of excessive regulation with the serious costs of anemic and badly resourced under-regulation. From big tech and their abuses of social media for profiteering, privacy erasure, excessive surveillance for private gain, and the rest, to telecom companies that treat consumers as bothers and irritants as opposed to clients, we see a cascading effect on freedom, privacy, safety, and fairness produced by this regulatory surrender. From Uber to Facebook, offshore capital to nominee and purposefully obscured corporate veils, to tax rates that advantage capital and investors over workers and employees, we have let the ideology of deregulation and regulatory naivety seriously dilute the distributional mission, which is as important to the success of a market-based economy as investment and hard work. 3, the pace of genuine reconciliation, economic inclusion, and the sharing of economic rents and royalties with First Nations is unjustifiably slow, unnecessarily complex. There is blame enough for the complexity and delays on all sides, but there is no excuse for letting that complexity be a place for governments and leaders to hide. The rights to education, language, culture, economic opportunity, and social and community stability are not less for First Nations than others. The design of a system of rents and royalties to be paid as a percentage of both profits and taxes earned by companies and governments working on First Nations land is eminently achievable if there is a will and a sense of urgency, as both history and present reality clearly demand. Delay and dysfunction by government at all levels and of all political parties and many bureaucracies is a denial of the justice and fairness we claim as hallmarks of Canadian society. 4, the disengagement of some governments from either economic investment to produce equality of opportunity at home or foreign development, aid to help create economic opportunity abroad in underdeveloped regions, raises self-serving and selfish complacency to new and deeply unproductive heights. Those heights are only dwarfed by the cost we will all pay, socially, internationally, and environmentally, for this deep disengagement. 5, the avoidance of war, the pursuit of peaceful step-by-step solutions, as opposed to armed confrontation worldwide, is almost always the sane and best-informed course of action. But an intrinsic naivety or purposeful self-delusion about the cost of that path, when doggedly and unreasonably adhered to, diminishes our own humanity. While Russian and Syrian bombers, artillery, and poison gas rain down on densely populated civilian Syrian cities and towns, killing thousands and wounding millions, forcing migration out of fear and desperation, were we right not to stand up to UN members responsible for this slaughter? I think not. And I think history is already telling us how red lines established and then abdicated by the democracies became open invitations for war crimes committed against civilians, hospitals, schools, children, which generated the desperate escape attempts through migration paths pursued, understandably, by so many. Global underregulation through a weakening or abdication of the balance of power threatens us all. Turning away from evil is always wrong, and giving evil license to continue unchecked sends a powerful message to those authoritarians, for whom the use of crushing force against civilians is merely another day at work. 6, if we were incensed about the Russian seizure of Crimea from Ukraine, or worried about the aggressive Chinese territorial presumption in the South China Sea, but avoided any genuine action when war crimes and cruelty were openly demonstrated by Assad with Russian support and Chinese patronage, the alleged constraining effect of the rules-based liberal order stands for little, when even the most basic rules of non-aggression and humanity are not defended. And people everywhere notice when we don't stand up for our own values. These are a few examples of where those who believe in the rules-based international order can and should be doing more here and elsewhere. There are consequences to abdication and turning away. There are consequences to only seeing weaknesses elsewhere without drilling down and addressing your own. There are huge gains to be made in global balance and systemic legitimacy by facing up to the real challenges that lay before us. The many efforts of Russian and Chinese and Iranian or North Korean governments to sow discord and confusion among and within Western democracies, efforts that have been documented as to their intent and areas of impact, are made more credible by our own hypocrisy or abdication of duty. To social and economic fairness, to global stability, critically important principles of non-aggression and a just peace. The civility of our own society is tied to the inherent respect for equality of opportunity, freedom, diversity, and inclusion that define our democracy and way of life. That civility is essential to sustaining the best parts of our way of life. Taking it for granted is fraught with danger. Activist engagement in support of that civility and its foundations is the beginning of wisdom. Simply defending our own way of life as superior without actually working hard to address the visible weaknesses that are real is both hollow and unhelpful. Rethinking the rules-based international liberal order means addressing its weaknesses and areas of failure. It is because we have the courage to do so that we can make that order stronger and more resilient. Let me leave you with one final idea before I take questions and any personal attacks you care to offer. Weaknesses admitted and addressed are a sign of strength, cohesion, and democratic purpose. Weaknesses denied, obscured, avoided, or blamed on others is a sign of insecurity and decay. If we believe that democracies that respect human rights, the rule of law, due process, diversity, inclusion, and civility are intrinsically stronger and more humane places to live than those dictatorships where excessive authority and the use of force with impunity are abusive, then the best way to preserve and deepen that strength is to address our own weaknesses with courage, frankness, and all the social and economic resources we can muster. And we should be doing so openly, in sharp contrast to the dictatorships for whom honesty and openness about weakness or domestic injustice is simply the ultimate crime. Authoritarian dictatorships dare not admit to their failings, for they are dependent on that fearful servility sustained by the threat of force and the preservation of the privilege of the very few. Democracy is about open debate, sustained ambition to do better, honesty about failings and ready improvement, and strength through better outcomes, more open processes, and genuine accountability. Facing up to our weaknesses is the very best way of building and broadening our strengths. If sustaining a global community where democracy and freedom is ascendant matters, as I believe it does, then I would argue that there's no other way. Thank you for letting me be with you here this morning.
You can see or stand.
Questions on this?
So we have two ways of doing questions in this series. We have Slido, and I know many of you are very comfortable with that. This is a great way, sorry about that, a great way for those who might be a little reluctant to put their hand up in such a large audience to get their question into the mix. I'm going to read out the first couple of questions and we'll let Hugh respond to them, and then we'll open up to the floor and we'll go around the floor and go back and forth. So the first question, why do you think that Trudeau stepped away from his campaign promises on electoral reform? What do you think?
Well, as someone who's been on the side of proportional representation with no apparent success for over 40 years, I was pretty enthusiastic about the promise that he made in the last campaign, and I actually think he was genuine when he made it. I don't think it was a false proposition. I think he believed the system would be better. Of course, when you're the third place political party seeking to make progress, proportional representation does look a touch more attractive than when you're in a government that's just been elected with 180 plus seats by the first past the post system. So I think that is the first challenge. The challenge of government is to slow down change, get in the way, and you'll get 1,000 wonderful representations from people in your own political party and in various others saying why that should not be done. And I recall the precise retort when he was questioned in the same way. He said, well, did you want Kelly Leach to have her own political party? Because with proportional representation, as we see in countries like Israel and Italy and elsewhere, very small groups that can generate 5% of a vote get a seat in the legislature, and they are a separate political party. Now, the argument made by the pro side is that, well, then you have to have multi-party coalitions. So by definition, there is more consensual approach to government. And to be fair, all of our European allies, except for the British, have used that system over the years. And even the British, to be fair, while they are in fact first past the post in terms of Westminster, they do have proportional representation in the election of the Scottish Assembly, the Welsh Assembly, and when it meets, it is allowed to meet, the Northern Irish Assembly. So they do have more of a blend than we do, and I think it was because the committee couldn't reach an agreement, And his own caucus members didn't really want to give up the successful path by which they had been elected, so he's probably tilting to his own caucus, which you don't do in the first few months after you're swept into office. But when you get into the midterm, and there are odd challenges that emerge of one form or another, keeping your caucus together is pretty important. That's my sense of why he didn't keep his promise, although I thought he himself probably very much wanted to do so. So that's because there are different conservative traditions. The one that I represent, which is a sort of red Tory, where the P and the C is bigger than the C approach, is we're kind of broadly outnumbered now amongst conservative. Nothing to protect us but the game laws, depending on what country you're in. And I think that there's always been a part of conservatism which has been about nationalism, which is not intrinsically bad. When I was 13, Prime Minister Diefenbaker stood up against the Americans because he did not want to be forced to have nuclear-tipped Bullmark missiles in Canada. He believed that that was wrong, and and Mike Pearson, who'd been a great proponent of peace, was of the same view until the pollster hired by the Americans to do the polling in the 1963 general election made it perfectly clear that the vast majority of Canadians wanted to keep the promise to bring the nuclear tips for the Bullmark missiles, that Mr. Pearson became in favor of nuclear-tipped Bullmark missiles. And that produced an election which ended Mr. Diefenbaker's career as Prime Minister. So there is that nationalist piece that you will find amongst conservatives. It doesn't have to be a small r in terms of right-wing or small m in terms of small-minded. It can sometimes just be about a legitimate reflection of our legitimate national interests. But I think part of what the Trump phenomena has produced is a sense of license about putting national sovereignty in all matters ahead of every other possible good. And as you will all come to understand, and those of you with experience will already know, most of what's decided by government is not a division between good and bad. It's a division between competing goods. So I would argue that when you have a NATO treaty, or you have a free trade agreement with the United States, or you have a treaty to establish United Nations Emergency Force, or whatever it is, you are giving up some of your sovereignty to a larger body that's going to pursue a global benefit. And clearly that is not where the Trump conservative perspective is coming from. And there is an element, obviously, in the Brexit debate where the Britons have taken, a large amount of Britons have taken a position against the European Union, which is an organization sustained by treaty and by rules. So even the worst of political tendencies do become a contagion on occasion. But I'm of the view that if we're sitting here in 5 years' time, we will wonder why it snapped back so quickly, and why is the world now more balanced than it was 5 years ago. So I'm an optimist on that front.
Graham Allison argued about a year ago that the post-war international order was a historical anomaly, an accident that could no longer apply, and that the United States in particular should turn to its own real internal problems as a priority. And there are others that argue that when the West allies say we, they really are depending on the U.S. To come to the example of Syria. Just because Mr. Obama didn't cross that line, it meant that other allies weren't free to do so. So the response is, can this work? Can this continue to work if Americans, and not just Trumpians, perceive that a disproportionate amount of responsibility? After all, Obama was the un-Bush. He didn't go in, not to repeat the mistakes of Mr. Bush, going in everywhere and defending in the name of international order. So my sense is it's not just against the order, but there's something else going on here, and whether we can reconstruct that post-war order as the basis for the future seems a little doubtful.
So Joel, I don't disagree with the core premise of your question. The circumstances today, pre-Trump, were very different from what they were in 1945, 1952, when the post-war order was constructed. NATO and the IMF and the World Bank. And now, of course, we have other important rebalancing. The Chinese are a huge economic international player. They weren't when, frankly, those institutions were designed, and to some extent, I think the Chinese are well within their rights to argue that they're being deeply underrepresented in those decision-making processes. So for any international order to survive, it has to change. It has to be prepared to make adaptations. And the notion that, of the banking authorities worldwide, the Europeans get one, the Americans get the other, interesting, but it's not clear how 1.6 billion of our fellow human beings in China get to play in that game with the influence they deserve. The case that I'm making is that we probably do not, as a small and middle power, not a major military power, have the ability to influence that all by ourselves. The thing that we can do the best, quite frankly, is to deal with those problems at home which threaten the legitimacy of democracy and its way of life in the lives of millions of Canadians, so that that becomes an example which is constructive elsewhere. And I also think that if you take the Syrian proposition specifically, when President Obama said there's a certain red line we will not cross, and then he crossed it because the Russians basically said to him, we can find a way to verify all the Syrian supplies of poison gas, so there's no need to have a conflagration. I think there was a failure of nerve on that part, well-intentioned, without question. But as soon as the Russians figured out that there was pretty well nothing they could do that would actually provide for a military response, that created a sense of license. And I think because the Russians and the Chinese do collaborate and share perspectives pretty generically, the Chinese are of the same view now with respect to the South China Sea, with respect to Taiwan, and with respect to hegemonic approach in that part of the world. And at some point, we either decide we care enough to engage or we don't. And at this moment in time, I worry that we are trying to avoid engagement, and we are underestimating the cost we will pay by avoiding that for a long period of time.
Based on your answer, do you think that the rules of international base order is not attainable, based on the fact that rising powers in Indo-Pacific countries are developing their own geolegal order? Do you agree with this?
So I don't believe it's not attainable, but I think it has to look different from what it looked like in the late 1940s. And I think it has to be shaped in a way which brings, for example, I would argue, and you can hear this from people in the investment business, that whatever the compelling attraction of the Chinese economy in a host of ways, the long-term investments are being made in the Indian economy because it has a greater durability, a higher level of growth over time, and because it has a measure of democracy and a measure of rule of law, which makes investing other people's money, pensioners' money, more viable over a long-term period of time. And I would argue that what Canada should be doing as a Commonwealth member and as a democracy is getting much closer to the countervailing powers. I look at our friends in South Korea, and if you ever want, I'm enough of a conservative to say if you look at the two countries after the end of the Korean War, one as a totalitarian, family-run communist dictatorship, and the other as a more free economy without democracy to begin with, but then it came over time, the level of immense growth and economic opportunity in South Korea is remarkably, by a factor 100 times, more compelling than our friends in the DPRK. So we have to find a way to embrace those changes. And when I made the case some time ago that freedom from fear and freedom from want as the two core freedoms should define our foreign policy priorities around the world, understanding that they are achieved by different instruments in different countries based on the local culture and history and tradition, I really did believe, and I still do believe, that that's the best way for Canada to make a contribution internationally and globally. And I'm also of the view that if we're going to want to use our armed forces, not for anything aggressive, but for aid to the civil power, which we've been doing a lot because of natural disasters, support of international coalitions, support of international humanitarian capacity, has to be substantially larger. We have to invest far more than we are if we want to have that ability. even just for humanitarian measures, let alone all the other combat-related capacities a modern armed force needs to have.
That's based on the leadership in the country, right? That will dictate.
Yep. That's what we have elections for. We choose our best leaders from those who are offered to us. And whenever you bump into people, as we all will during the campaign, saying, I don't like any of the leaders. None of them are up to our standard. And I remember when I was on Mr. Mulroney's staff, it was our job to go to him with the research that said how many people didn't like him and why they didn't like him. This is before he won a second election in '88. And he would look at me and he would say in his own inimical fashion, please don't compare me to Moses, Muhammad, or Jesus, just to the other guy on the ballot. And that's what the democratic system tends to be.
I'd like to follow your answer about Canada's involvement in the international, especially in the Western Pacific. Canadian warships sailed through Taiwan Strait for the second time, as far as I know, just a few days ago. And I guess Canadian warship also is patrolling somewhere in the South China Sea. And as far as we can see from the case of Mo and Zhou, Huawei, Beijing is very tough against Canadians. And as far as I know, in a history like Korean War, Beijing deliberately selected some allied forces and attacked it. So my question is, to what extent Canadian publics were ready to go to a confrontation against Beijing ahead of the United States?
It's a very good question. Look, I'm a parent of a daughter, so I worry about things. Everybody's favorite Canadian, Bianca Andreescu, is going to be playing in a major tennis tournament in China in October. I worry about that. Not that she won't win, she'll do very well. But are the Chinese so bloody-minded about Canadians? Is it safe for her to go? What guarantees are we going to get? Who's going to give us the guarantees? Who's going to hold them accountable for those? That being said, I would argue that there is an intrinsic rationality to history of Chinese diplomacy, Chinese military proposition. It may be opposed to our interests on occasion, it may be too aggressive from time to time, but essentially it is a rational, careful management and assessment of their own interests on a geopolitical basis. So I think the present government did the right thing by trying to gather up support from other important allies and trading partners of the Chinese on this file. And I think it says something about the relationship between Huawei and the intrinsic international intelligence and commercial interests of China per se on the 5G plateau that indicated why they responded to Canada simply doing its appropriate part in an extradition treaty with the United States. And the notion that we had no choice but to do what the treaty called for is something which Chinese diplomacy is not prepared to admit to, however well they understand it fully and constructively. So the notion of a particular military engagement between Canada and China is not something which I think is a rational planning proposition. But the notion of a joint engagement around the South China Sea, self-determination for Taiwan, and a host of other areas that involves the Australians, the Americans, and the Canadians, and other regional powers does make substantial sense. And we have to be prepared to engage in the Pacific Western area to build that kind of alliance and make it a little bit more tough-edged than it's been to date. I'm aware of, it's public domain, that a Canadian naval task force went to South Korea during the height of the blockade, docking at Incheon and all the normal diplomatic niceties, but what is not generally known is that we had 2 of our submarines deployed to assist with the monitoring of the blockade. and that through Canadian periscopes, photographs of foreign ships violating the blockade with our North Korean friends were shared broadly with NATO and other navies, because that's what submarines can do constructively. So while Canada does not overstate the significance of that, we are doing the best we can with the resources we have, and I'd like to see us doing more with more resources over time.
That, and from Slido, is NATO still vital to Canada's security interests?
The answer to that is yes. As a middle power, we cannot sustain on our own, nor should we try, all the military, strategic, and intelligence capacity to carry our fair share of the load. The capacity of NATO to have brought the thermonuclear threat with the old Soviet Union to an end without a shot being fired should never be underestimated. It seems now like just one of those historic things that happened, but it required a tremendous amount of engagement and planning. As we sit here today, there are NATO officers at Canadian bases learning NATO doctrine, being trained on NATO logistics and other issues, so that they can work in a more seamless way with their Canadian, American, British, and other colleagues in the event the balloon should ever go up. And of course, the purpose of NATO is to keep the balloon from ever going up, because those who would be so adventurous as to produce that risk understand that the risk is just too high. And the best answer to a military conflict is to keep the conflict from happening, because the balance of power is such that those who might think they can get away with something understand more fully that they can't. So I think we need NATO, and I think Canada should be. I'm one of those, that one of the few things that President Trump has talked about where I think he deserves a measure of credit is suggesting that NATO members should be spending more of their gross domestic product on pulling their fair share. And it is, to give the present government credit, we're now approaching 70,000, 72,000 full complement in the Canadian forces. There is new cyber and other commands which are modernizing our forces' capacity to engage. I heard a head of the Navy say when he was doing some recruiting at the University of Toronto a few years ago, I don't just need men and women of action, I need nerds of action, because of the high-tech nature of what our navies are now doing. I'm simply of the view that we can be doing better, and I think the present government deserves credit for letting the numbers creep up. They are slowly making some procurement decisions, not without some difficulty, but at least it's heading in the right direction. I give them credit for that without regard to any partisan bias. And I do believe the Chinese, when they say that they are looking for a long-term relationship that is constructive, but they have their own internal, I mean, we talk about democracy and the accountability and our ability to throw out governments and all of that good stuff. But the truth of the matter is that if you look at the rising tide of demonstrators in Moscow and how badly the governing party did in their recent municipal elections, and while politics in China is different in structure, tone, and substance from ours, there is not a disconnect between the members of the Politburo and the Supreme Communist Body and the level of success and difficulty on the ground in a host of areas. And so my view is that once we figure out a way through the Huawei problem, and I'm one of those who accepts the advice of our security people that we have to be very careful with Huawei, I do think that the British, who are not naive on matters of global or national security, finding a way to involve Huawei in the private sector, but not letting them be part of global government public systems, may be a path forward. I leave that to the experts. But I'm not negative about the ability of that relationship to reconstitute. But I do think erring on the side of toughness now and erring on the side of consequences now, quite frankly, we have a tremendous influx of Chinese money and Chinese students and Chinese tourists on a regular basis, all of which is intrinsically good, but all of which can be made more difficult if we ended up in a circumstance. Just having people apply for a visa 12 months before they get it would have a huge impact. And the people whose kids are coming from China to build their lives in part here in Canada are not coming from the poorest aspects of Chinese society. They're coming from the folks who are very much near the top in business and in government terms. And I remember when our government made the terrible mistake, in my judgment, of forcing all Mexicans to apply for visas before they came to Canada. It's a horrific decision. The Mexicans thought this through. And their response was not to make all the Canadian tourists who go to Mexico get a visa, but to say those of us with green and red passports, which a few of us had, we had to get visas. Because they wanted to send a specific message to the governing class about how unfair what the government of Canada was doing to Mexicans generally was. And I recall a conference the IRPP was doing with Southern Methodist University and our friends at Colegio Mexico on immigration, where the speaker, the keynote speaker, was the Speaker of the Mexican Parliament. And he had to start by talking to us, Chateau Laurier Hotel, about 400 people, but what he had to prove to the Canadian customs officer before they let him into the country, that he wasn't coming to get a job, that he did have a house back in Mexico City, that he was going to go back and continue with his role as Speaker of the Mexican House. All of which spoke to a level of, I think, stupidity on the part of our immigration policy at the time, which is the sort of thing we need to avoid always. And I do not blame the Chinese people for the intransigence of their government. I make a distinction, just as I don't blame the average citizen in Russia for some of the silly things that the Putin administration does. But we have to look at the tools we have and use them rationally and effectively to achieve legitimate and appropriate goals.
Do we have other questions from the floor? I'm bringing the mic.
It's okay, I can project.
Are you going to
Hi,
project?
my name is Julia, I'm with the PMPA.
Yep.
Hi there, my name is Julia, I'm a student with the PMPA program. I'm curious to what you think with voter participation being a part of the hot topics for the upcoming election. What you think the key would be to democratic participation in general? Where are we lacking? How can it be improved?
So there were actually, and for those of us who like the design of various programs, there were things that were done independent of any partisan interest to increase the participation of voters in the last general election. The Chief Electoral Officer of Canada had an advisory committee, which was sort of people who were no longer in active politics but had been involved and so knew how the system worked. There was a socialist, there was a Reform Party member, there was a conservative, there were liberals, there were blockade, there was a whole range of people. And the question being put was, what can we do with the system to get more people to vote? So one of the things that had been very discouraging was what young people as students had to go through to get their vote counted. It was a horrific maze of where is your vote going to get counted, when's the election day going to be, how does it connect with exams, are there many days on which you can vote, where are the polling stations going to be. So the advice we gave the Chief Electoral Officer, which he accepted to his credit, was to have many polling stations, many days when students could vote while meeting their other obligations as students, letting the students decide where the vote would be counted and not have some obscure rule deciding where the vote was counted. And for that and other reasons, maybe the marijuana question, maybe the attractiveness of the third-party leader at the time, Mr. Troodos, the vote went from 29% to 59% turnout. Had a huge impact across the country on the results of that election. The decision was also made by Chief Bellegarde of the AFN to encourage First Nation members across the country to actually vote, when he himself had not voted as a matter of principle. And that also increased in a whole bunch of constituencies where First Nation votes are tremendously significant in terms of impact, their turnout. So there are structural things we can do to increase turnout on an ongoing basis. In terms of what's going to drive issues, the numbers that I have seen, and some of these were presented at the Queen's International Social Policy Institute in August, is that Canadians are not angst-ridden, generally speaking, about the economy. Alberta being a bit of a standout on that. They're more concerned. Quebecers are much more optimistic about economic prospects than they have been for a very, very long time. But the one area that is seriously problematic is everybody's concerned about housing. Either parents are concerned that their kids are never going to be able to rent an apartment in a big city, let alone buy a home. And of course, if you're a parent on the way to you're middle-aged or you're planning on retirement, you know that any insufficiency that your kids face is going to be something you're going to have to or want to address. Then the issue is, do you have the ability to do that? So I'm not surprised that the Liberals have begun the campaign by dealing with access questions to the housing market, which means that they're seeing the same research that we saw at the QISP in August here in Kingston. And I think there are some of those issues, like housing, for example. I think the healthcare issue at the federal level will come down to a discussion of pharmacare, which is going to be quite a serious engagement. And while I think all the parties will sort of be kind of maybe a bit in favor, the issue will be, what's the instrumentality? Because 85% of Canadians now do have some health coverage through their employment or as pensioners, as the case may be. Provinces in Quebec view it as a very exclusive provincial jurisdiction. So Quebec will say, just give us the money, we'll figure it out. We're not going to have a national plan, which is something they have done historically over the years, and people like Mike Pearson were accommodating to that on the Canada Pension Plan and others. So I think it's going to be those kinds of lifestyle and fairness issues. I'd like to believe, and this may just be my own prayer as opposed to substantive, is that there will be increased concern about the gap, the income gap, because while there has been some progress, depending on the subgroup of Canadians that we measure, 9% generically, as many as 15% in rural Canada, and well into the late 30s and early 40% of our First Nations brothers and sisters are living beneath the poverty line. And existing welfare programs, however well-intentioned, don't pay any recipient more than about 50% of the poverty line. So the notion that welfare solves the problem is really untrue. What welfare does is trap people in poverty, because if you're a recipient of Ontario Works, or its equivalent across Canada, if you find a job that generates more than $200 a month, they claw that money back. So in fact, it's a powerful disincentive. So we have programs aimed at abating poverty, but really only keep poverty alive and well and keep people trapped in the cycle. So I'm hopeful that with all the debates, some of this will come out and become part of what people vote on.
So I do see hands up, and I know people want to keep this conversation going, but I also know that it's 1 o'clock and that there are people that need to move on to the next thing in their day. So this is where we're going to end the formal session. I hope that you'll all join me in thanking Hugh Segal.